Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from across Australia today, and welcome to the launch of Roses in the Ocean's lived experience of suicide, informed and inclusive culture change suite of resources. Gee, that was more of a mouthful than I was expecting up front, but welcome everybody. For those who may be online who I've not met before, my name's Jaylee Skean. I'm the director of Everymind, and I've been asked by Bronwyn Edwards and the team at Roses in the Ocean to steer people through this online launch of resources today. Everymind is a sector colleague, collaborator, partner and listener of Roses in the Ocean. And I think I'd also say we're going to be one of the end recipients or the end users of the resources that are going to be launched today. So I'm really pleased to be here to support the launch of these important resources. I'd like to thank up front the speakers that we're going to be having today as part of this launch session, which is the Honourable David Coleman, Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention. We're also going to be joined by Christine Morgan, CEO of the National Mental Health Commission and National Suicide Prevention Advisor, who's online. By Sam Phipps, who's the chair of Roses in the Ocean's Lived Experience Advisory Committee, and by Bronwyn Edwards, who's the CEO of Roses in the Ocean. As we listen to the presenters today, please feel free to be an active participant and put any comments, reflections or questions that you have in the chat box as we go along. While we're not going to have a dedicated time for answering questions today at this launch event, what the Roses in the Ocean team and network have committed to doing is getting in contact with people over the next couple of days and responding to and answering those questions or comments that people may have. The other thing is that the session today is also being audio recorded, so people will be provided with a copy of the audio and the video recording. So please feel free to share it with your networks, to share it with people across your organisation or in your communities that might not have had a chance to log on and be part of the live launch today, because what's going to be really important as we go forward is that people are well oriented into these resources, understand how they can be used and how they can change our practice together in suicide prevention. So we want as many people as possible to have access to those resources. To kick off the proceedings today, I'm first going to hand over to Sam Phipps, who's going to do an acknowledgement of country and an acknowledgement of lived experience. Sam is the fabulous chair of Roses in the Ocean's Lived Experience Advisory Committee, and I'd like to now hand you over to Sam.
Thanks so much, Jaylee, and welcome to everyone. I'd firstly like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. We acknowledge and reflect on the fact that Roses in the Ocean conducts our services on custodial lands of the oldest living civilization in the world. We pay our respects to the people and their elders, past, present and emerging, of all the lands we collectively gather on today, for they hold the hopes, dreams, traditions and cultures of Aboriginal Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge those with a lived experience of suicide. We acknowledge those who have considered ending their life and those who have attempted to do so. We acknowledge your courage and tenacity to carry and move through the immense pain. We acknowledge those who care for loved ones through a suicidal crisis. We acknowledge the fear and helplessness you experience and your endless endeavours to empower them to live. We acknowledge those bereaved through suicide. May your immeasurable loss define a legacy and a mission to discover healing and a new purpose. And we acknowledge all the lives we have lost to suicide and those who are struggling with life today. Everyone's lived experience is unique and everyone's lived experience is valuable and everyone's lived experience can make a difference. Thanks so much, Jaylee.
Thanks, Sam. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar today from beautiful Newcastle on the lands of the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge the critical and important role of lived experience to our work in suicide prevention, but also to our communities at large, and also to say a thank you to everyone who's been involved in the development of the resources being launched today, but also to the generosity of people who've been working over decades and decades, either in the light or in the shadows, to really try and change things for the better in suicide prevention to ensure we have that lived experience-led approach. I am still learning and will continue to learn from people with lived experience of suicide. I think it's really important, and I think acknowledge that really to drive change as a suicide prevention sector, we need to position lived experience knowledge at the forefront of our research, of our policy, of our practice, and indeed in our reform agenda that we are excitingly kind of moving into and involved in here in Australia. Without that kind of lived experience leadership, that lived experience co-design and information that's required, our reforms, our services, our systems are not going to meet people's needs, what they deserve, what they require, their preferences, all of the above. But I guess one of the things I'd say is that talking about lived experience, inclusion, involvement and leadership is one thing. Writing it in documents is also a relatively easier thing to do. But actually putting it in practice on the ground where it really matters is actually a challenging and a difficult thing at times for people to do. One of my favourite philosophers at the moment is Ted Lasso. In one of the episodes of Ted Lasso, he said something like, it's like riding a horse. If it feels comfortable, you're probably doing it wrong. So I guess my call to action today as we go through this, but actually as a sector going forward, that we all actually agree to get a little uncomfortable together with the intention of starting to get some of this work right. But I think that's going to require some of us in suicide prevention leadership roles to give up some power, to not just invite people with lived experience to the table, but to preference those voices at the table. And also to ensure that the work we're doing is meaningful to all people, to the end recipients of that work, to the people who are providing services, whether they are our health providers, our other government providers, whether they're peer workers or other lived experience providers. It's really critical that we find a way of working together and finding space at that table and informing leadership where it needs to come from. So I'm really particularly excited about the release of these resources from today. As I said up front, our organisations and the organisations that we work alongside of will be critical users of them. My staff will be oriented to the resources. And so I'm really thankful to Roses for bringing their 10 plus, I think we're 11 years now, Bron, years of expertise, but also the large networks of people all across Australia whose expertise is referenced in these resources being released today. And I've had a sneak peek at them. So I'm very, very lucky and fortunate. So without further ado, and just in time, I'm going to hand over to the Honourable David Coleman, Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, to make some opening remarks. Thank you so much for your time today, Minister Coleman.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And it's really good to be here to discuss this very important topic and to really acknowledge the very important work that Roses in the Ocean does through these resources and much more broadly as well. So really pleased to be a part of today's event, and thank you to Bronwyn and everyone at Roses in the Ocean for what you do. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet right across the country. And I'd also importantly like to acknowledge all Australians with the lived experience of suicide, their loved ones, and all Australians who live with mental ill health. In 2020, 3,139 Australians died by suicide. Now, while the 2020 national suicide rate was the lowest since 2016 and a 5% reduction from 2019, one life lost to suicide is obviously one too many. The highest proportion of suicides occurred among young and middle-aged people. And that's why the government is committed to working towards zero suicides and transforming the mental health system to ensure that all Australians can access the right care when and where they need it. And we're making very significant inroads. But our mental health and suicide prevention system needs to be informed by the insights of people with lived experience of mental ill health and people who have experience of suicide attempts, be that themselves or others, and those who care for those people. The Australian government considers that a whole of government approach informed by lived experience, which responds earlier to distress, is needed to prevent suicide. And I think it's really important to note that in recent years, we've come a long way, I think, in the community in understanding the criticality of mental health issues and the importance of suicide prevention, and also, very importantly, the importance of lived experience and ensuring that in clinical environments we draw on people with lived experience. Now, in the budget, we outlined the depth of our commitment, and it's a $2.3 billion investment to really transform the mental health and suicide prevention system. Within that, $300 million in initiatives specifically for suicide prevention programs. And there are a couple of initiatives within that funding that I wanted to talk a little bit about today. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to die by suicide at more than twice the rate of non-Indigenous people. And that's why we're working with the Indigenous mental health sector to co-design solutions and reduce those very high rates of suicide and mental ill health in the Indigenous community. Under the Indigenous-led National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Strategy, the government's investing $1.1 million to be provided to the Black Dog Institute to work with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Lived Experience Centre, supporting the inclusion of people with lived experience in the co-design, implementation and evaluation of suicide prevention activity. This is important work that's been complemented by the work of organisations like Roses in the Ocean. We're also investing $2.1 million to expand Roses in the Ocean's own Peer Care Connect service. Peer Care Connect is a safe place for people with a lived experience of suicide to connect with others. The service provides people with an opportunity to connect, to be heard, and for their distress to be compassionately explored and understood by another person with a meaningful shared experience. It's a very important service, and it's one that we're proud to support. I'm also proud to be part of today's launch of this new suite of resources developed by Roses in the Ocean, which will guide staff and organisations intending to or already partnering with people with lived experience of suicide. These guides will help underpin a best practice approach by ensuring people with lived experience are engaged in the design and delivery of the services that are intended for them. Inclusivity and representation matters. These resources will help organisations and policymakers deliver and design care that will reduce distress and ultimately save lives. Thank you again, Bronwyn, and all of your team at Roses in the Ocean for your tremendous dedication and commitment on the very important work that you do as we all work together towards zero suicides in Australia. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Honourable David Coleman for coming and joining us live today. Really appreciate your time. So next on the proceedings, I'm going to hand over to Bronwyn Edwards, who is the CEO of Roses in the Ocean and probably doesn't need much of an introduction in this environment, but just wanted to flag that I think 11 years ago, when I think I first met Bronwyn, perhaps at a National Suicide Prevention Conference, I think Roses in the Ocean was just a small kind of seed of an idea of an organisation that was truly kind of focused on lived experience of suicide, and to see the organisation, the networks that connect to the organisation and the influence and expertise, I think, grow over that 11 years has been a great thing to witness, to partner with, to be part of. And I think the kind of practical advocacy, the practical and supported advice and the elevation of lived experience, not just knowledge but expertise, has been critical in shifting our suicide prevention sector over that last 11 years, and really pleased to hear from Bron to kind of take us through the resources that are being launched today, the principles behind them, and actually how we might apply them and use them as a broader sector. Over to you, Bron.
Thank you so much, Jaylee, and lovely to see everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So look, I would firstly just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners on which I'm coming to you from today. I'm here in Brisbane. That's the home of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone with the lived experience of suicide here online and also throughout all of our communities. So without further ado, I'll share my screen to you now and we'll get underway. First of all, thank you also, Minister. Thank you so much for joining us today to open this launch and for your remarks, which really highlight your genuine understanding of and belief in the importance of integrating people with lived experience of suicide and the leadership and the solutions that their insights bring to suicide prevention reform. I'd also take this opportunity to thank Christine for being here, and you'll hear from Christine a little later, and also Jaylee for your support with this launch today also. So the suite of resources includes a number of documents. We have the Lived Experience of Suicide Engagement Principles, a guidance document, Lived Experience of Suicide Engagement, Participation and Integration Framework. There is a comprehensive implementation toolkit that accompanies that framework and unpacks it more. Decision and evaluation tools. Building a lived experience informed and inclusive culture, a practical guide for organisations. A lived experience of suicide language and imagery guide that's been extensively expanded. And co-designing with people with lived experience of suicide, a planning guide. So we believe that these resources meet the need for specific guidelines for lived experience of suicide engagement, integration and partnership. There has been, of course, significant increase in policy, program and research, co-design and co-production activity in recent years that involve mental health consumers and carers, a mainstream recognition of the fact that they are experts of experience of what works and what needs to improve. As a result of this significant activity at a regional, state and national level, there have been several guidelines and frameworks produced by government agencies, organisations and lived experience experts that aim to articulate best practice principles and approaches for engaging people with lived experience. However, conceptualising suicidality as exclusively a mental health issue fails to appreciate the situational and social distress that often leads people to end their lives or attempt to do so. And it doesn't capture the nuanced needs of people caring for loved ones through suicidal crisis and those who are bereaved by suicide. So this suite of resources builds on what has come before it from other health contexts, overlays that with our 10 years of experience in developing best practice and generating evidence for the meaningful engagement and integration of people with a lived experience of suicide. And it provides a roadmap and practical implementation tools to guide and support individuals, service providers, researchers, organisations and governments to systematically embed lived experience of suicide engagement and partnership principles and expertise across all suicide prevention activity. In doing so, they provide the basis of support for us to collectively embrace the lived experience of suicide informed and inclusive culture change that we really believe is required to realise the system reform that is articulated within national recommendations such as the shifting the focus, supporting a comprehensive whole of government's approach to suicide prevention. So first of all, let's have a look at the lived experience of suicide engagement principles guidance document. This document sets out the foundational principles of safe, effective and sustainable engagement and partnership with people with lived experience of suicide. It's been developed to be used in conjunction with the 6 other key guidance documents, and they collectively support that lived experience informed culture change. The 5 key principles in this document: trust and safety, respect and compassion, collaboration and power sharing, transparency and accountability, diversity and inclusion. The core concepts that are articulated in this document can also be summarised as a set of key messages in its introduction. You can read that in the introduction of the document. Lived experience of suicide is unique, complex, and multi-layered. But recognition that approximately half the people who die by suicide do not have a diagnosed mental illness, that suicide does not discriminate and it impacts people of all walks of life. Humility is a powerful bridge to greater understanding and more effective solutions. That it's imperative that we match the nature of lived experience of suicide to the purpose of an individual initiative. It recognises that lived experience expertise is more than just sharing a story. It is grounded in a sophisticated ability to utilise those insights with meaning and purpose. But to enable the full breadth and diversity of lived experiences to be represented, it's necessary to adequately resource individually tailored, culturally appropriate mechanisms for engagement and participation. We recognise that power imbalances are real and must be named and acknowledged before they can be rebalanced. And that people with lived experience are profoundly resilient and thrive in cultures of respect, compassion, and collaboration. And finally, that it's important to consider and understand the benefits of both internal and external lived experience expertise. Most importantly, it's critical to note that authentic engagement with people with lived experience of suicide requires more than just compliance with the lived experience of suicide engagement principles set out in this guide. It involves a genuine commitment to living the principles, which are articulated in this publication as statements of commitment. So each of the 5 principles is expressed on a single page with a narrative on what it looks like in practice, and then is accompanied by lived experience quotes of what it actually feels like when this principle is honoured. The first principle being trust and safety, and the statement of commitment: we're dedicated to establishing and maintaining authentic relationships of trust and an environment of physical, emotional, and cultural safety. Respect and compassion. Statement of commitment: we are dedicated to honouring our common humanity, respecting difference, and treating others with compassion. Collaboration and power sharing: we are dedicated to showing humility and generosity to create space for others to meaningfully contribute. Transparency and accountability: we are dedicated to ensuring all our communications and actions are honest, open, and transparent, and we hold ourselves accountable for them. Diversity and inclusion: we are dedicated to ensuring equitable and inclusive representation of the full breadth and diversity of lived experience of suicide. The next document in the series is the Lived Experience of Suicide Engagement, Participation and Integration, or short LICEPI framework. And it's been developed to provide a systematic way to think about and embed lived experience of suicide engagement principles across all suicide prevention activity. For example, it does this by offering a way of mapping the engagement and participation of people with lived experience across all stages of a project or service, from creation and design to governance and management and delivery and evaluation. It can also be utilised by organisations who are seeking to embed lived experience throughout their organisations, including their outward-facing services, who are employing people in lived experience of suicide identified roles, or maybe seeking to meet the lived experience of suicide accreditation standard number 3 of the National Suicide Prevention Accreditation Program that is administered by SPA. The framework also addresses the critical need for broad external stakeholder engagement and provides the basis for government and individual government departments to work towards whole of government suicide prevention system reform. The lived experience of suicide engagement principles underpin this framework, which is designed to be used in conjunction with the other resources within this suite. It builds on previous frameworks, including the Lifespan Lived Experience Framework, which was developed in 2016. However, we did decide to structure it slightly differently to others, in that it maps the context of individuals, programs and services, organisational and external stakeholders against each of the 5 lived experience of suicide engagement principles. And we chose to do that because it's in recognition that culture change is dependent upon honouring these engagement principles in every aspect of suicide prevention. So you'll see when you have the opportunity to review the framework that it outlines how the individual engagement principle plays out in the various contexts. So for an individual, as I said before, within a program or service, throughout an organisation, and in partnering and influencing external stakeholders. Now, we know that frameworks frequently fall into the trap of either being too short, with not enough information to really get your teeth into and act on without reading a very lengthy accompanying document, or they're so detailed that they end up sitting on a shelf. So we have strived to find a happy medium with the LSEPI framework, and we've chosen to then develop the LSEPI implementation toolkit to support its practical realisation. So this toolkit has been developed to provide organisations, service providers and teams with practical guidance on how to implement the lived experience of suicide engagement, participation and integration framework. And it ensures accountability mechanisms are built into this implementation process. So it's been designed to be useful to a wide range of internal and external staff and to be flexibly deployed for a wide range of purposes, from the engagement of small groups of individuals for time-limited consultation and co-design processes through to longer-term projects. It's also been developed to be an equally useful resource for individuals with a lived experience of suicide who are considering engaging in an initiative or taking up a professional role, so that they are fully informed about best practice engagement, participation and integration methods. Providing the information contained within this toolkit to people with a lived experience of suicide is another way that organisations can ensure engagement is meaningful and purposeful, and that they honour their accountability for their engagement, participation and integration practices. The toolkit sets out a series of how-tos that function as part of the whole document, or they can also be used as single practical tip sheets. Topics are grouped into common high-level engagement themes, which are then broken down into the relevant how-tos, which provide a snapshot of key considerations, practical tips, as well as links to other supporting resources. So we envisage that this resource will be regularly added to as people begin using it, begin integrating and partnering with people with lived experience of suicide more. We will be constantly looking for opportunities to expand this and meet any special requests and what have you that you uncover that it would be helpful to add resources to. Currently, there are 5 key sections within the implementation toolkit: deciding the level of engagement that is realistic and appropriate, effectively recruiting people with lived experience of suicide to a project or an initiative, supporting the engagement of people with lived experience of suicide, effectively partnering with people with lived experience of suicide, and communicating openly and transparently. And then there's a range of tip sheets under each of those sections. The next document in the series is the Lived Experience of Suicide Engagement, Participation and Integration Decision and Evaluation Tool. And this consists of a simple flowchart to help guide your decision-making process to determine the minimum level of engagement appropriate for a given purpose. It's been designed to complement the IAP2 spectrum of public participation, which I think many of you would be very, very familiar with. That has been just slightly adapted for the suicide context. So let me walk you through the decision-making tool process. The first question that is asked is, does the issue directly impact people with lived experience of suicide and/or vulnerable or priority population groups? If the answer to that question is yes, then the minimum engagement level is collaborate, with the recommended engagement level being empower on the IAP2 spectrum. If the answer to that question is no, we ask that people ask themselves a further 2 questions. Does the issue have the potential to contribute to or cause emotional distress or suicidal thoughts? And does the issue relate to any known underlying contributing factors to suicide? For example, relationships, finance, housing, suicide means, existing mental health issues. If either of those questions is answered yes, then the minimum engagement level would be collaborate, with the recommended level being empower. If no, then the level of engagement can be determined by the available time and resources, but that capacity must be communicated clearly and compassionately, and that the minimum engagement level that would be acceptable would be consult. So from the decision tool comes the evaluation tool, which supports and ensures an ongoing commitment to the iterative nature of co-design and co-production, and an accountability mechanism to demonstrate genuine and meaningful engagement, participation and integration of people with lived experience of suicide. So once again, this is mapped against each of the lived experience of suicide engagement principles that we started off with. It requires us to first begin with the desired end result in mind. It then gives an example of what low, medium and high engagement actually looks like. And finally, the evidence of engagement is actually framed from the perspective of the person with lived experience of suicide. And this is really important because ultimately it needs to be the people with lived experience of suicide that evaluate the level of engagement and how meaningful it has been. So now we've also developed a practical guide for organisations to support them as they build towards a lived experience informed and inclusive culture. This document provides practical advice to organisations seeking to establish, embed and sustain a lived experience informed and inclusive culture by building an internal lived experience workforce and overlaying a lived experience of suicide lens across all activity and relationships. So this document here is a standard organisational guide, which can be further added to or adapted to meet specific circumstances and needs of individual organisations who may be operating in different industries, in different contexts, or with specific population groups. This base version addresses the value of integrating lived experience of suicide and then has 3 key sections, which is unpacked in more detail: organisational readiness, creating and maintaining an inclusive working environment, providing ongoing support to ensure sustainability. So I'll take you briefly through each section. The organisational readiness explores an organisation's suicide prevention culture from the lens of lived experience and works to provide the foundation for shared understanding and progression. So you can see the key areas within this particular sectional chapter there on screen. Things like what are the key catalysts for culture change, challenging assumptions and addressing stigma, clarifying what the role of lived experience is, developing that lived experience informed suicide literacy, building that lived experience capacity within the organisational department, really communicating the meaning and value of lived experience to staff, and adapting workplace governance structures. And at the end of each section, there's an organisational health check, which guides an organisation to identify existing strengths, future opportunities, and start collating and adding to the resources that can help support their work. So the next section's around creating and maintaining an inclusive working environment. Once again, focus areas up there on your screen, looking at recruiting, how do you integrate these specific roles into an organisation, developing that cohesive team, really looking closely at equality, diversity and inclusion. What sort of adjustments do you need to make within a working environment or specific roles, and looking at that continuous improvement. And once again, an organisational health check to help organisations work out where they are and where they need to go. And then providing ongoing support to ensure sustainability, looking at that monitoring and co-reflection, supporting someone to return to work after a suicide crisis or attempt or a bereavement. What does professional development look like in this context? How might you go about educating your external stakeholders? And what is the role of lived experience of suicide allies or champions within an organisation? So moving on to the language and imagery guide now. So in recent years, there's been much greater focus on communication guidelines for people working within and communicating about suicide prevention. The National Communications Charter and the Mindframe Media Guidelines, of course, are 2 excellent points of reference to guide safe and responsible communications about suicide. From a lived experience of suicide perspective, however, we feel that we need to go even further and be even more attuned to the potential impact that language and imagery can have on those who read, hear and see our communications. Both have the ability to evoke strong emotions and memories and will be experienced differently based on an individual's experiences. So of course, Roses in the Ocean takes a lived experience informed lens to everything we do, because every one of us has a lived experience of suicide. But we really do pay incredibly close attention to language and imagery. We are continuously seeking input on, discussing and exploring the evolution of language and imagery within the context of suicide. So our role we see as simply to continue to explore and discuss language. So in this guide, in its current version, we're presenting language that's becoming widely adopted in our communities alongside emerging language in various contexts. So we are representative of the depth and diversity of perspectives and opinions regarding language. And whilst every person we know won't feel strongly about all words and aspects explored in this guide, all of it has come directly from people with lived experience, which means we have had people express the impact that anything in this guide has had on them personally, and that's informed what has been showcased here. So we believe in the fundamental principle of do no harm. And if harm can be brought upon some, then it's best avoided. We are, of course, very cognizant also of the danger of sanitising our ability to talk about suicide, as was outlined in a presentation poster at the recent International Association of Suicide Prevention World Congress that was prepared by our Lived Experience Advisory Group. But as always, time, place, context and audience has a large role to play in the choice of language at any given time. We showcase how people with lived experience of suicide are sharing with us opportunities to influence biomedical language and language that people are asking to be used in non-clinical safe spaces and outreach services. We absolutely understand that some of that language in our clinical world needs to remain, but people with lived experience are starting to question whether all of it does, and some alternatives are being suggested in this guide. So the next stage for this guide is for us to work with partners in the LGBTIQA+ and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander sectors and our cultural and linguistically diverse communities to expand this resource further and or reference existing resources. The inclusion of imagery in this guide is unique, and it shares components of our critical lens training. Imagery has often been a focus in the context of mental health, yet little work has been done to date regarding the impact of imagery in the context of suicide. With over 10 years of working with people with lived experience and experiencing their reactions to images has led us to develop training to highlight the types of images that we need to be aware of. Look, we absolutely acknowledge that we will undoubtedly be far more conscious of this than other organisations due to the nature of who we are. And some of you may feel that some of our guidelines are maybe a little strict, but once again, our advice in this guide comes directly from feedback with people with lived experience. And most often the impact that's described to us is related to an image actually providing a visual linkage to a particular suicide method or an experience of power imbalance, and similarly common expectations of people who are struggling to be the ones to reach out for help. So training workshops have been developed to support and expand on the content within this language and imagery, because it's a fascinating space to actually just sit within and open up conversations and listen to everybody's different perspectives. Included in the appendix of this document are a number of discussion papers about language that we've released in recent years, including that poster presentation I mentioned before. So now the final document in the suite relates to co-design. We have learned so much over recent years about co-designing with people with lived experience of suicide for solutions and services for people with lived experience of suicide. There are definitely additional considerations that are required when you're working in areas where the stakes are so high and very real power imbalances exist and provide a barrier to truth telling. So this planning guide provides insight into and shares what we have learnt over many years co-designing training content, workshops, programs, peer-enhanced services, non-clinical safe spaces, and of course the Lived Experience of Suicide Warm Line SP Peer Care Connect. The planning guide addresses things like, what is co-design and why do we do it, the values and principles of co-design, co-designing specifically with people with lived experience of suicide, who needs to participate, what are some of the considerations required before undertaking co-design, and it provides an overview, of our co-design approach, process and framework, sharing with you what we've learned over recent years. There is another co-designing guide that will be released soon, which is specific to safe spaces also. So that's a relatively quick, believe it or not, tour through our lived experience of suicide-informed and inclusive culture change suite of resources. Next steps for us, there will, as I mentioned right at the beginning, there'll be ongoing resource development, particularly in that implementation toolkit. We have commenced discussions with SBA, which is fantastic, about just developing a shorter resource that will highlight the key aspects of these resources that will be helpful for organisations that are looking to meet standard number 3 of the suicide prevention accreditation standards. And there is going to be future adaptation of the lived experience of suicide engagement, participation and integration framework for specific contexts. So think research, think suicide prevention peer workforce, adaptations for individual organisations, government departments. We've done work recently with Victoria's Suicide Prevention and Response Office to adapt the framework to meet their very specific needs as they move to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So it's really interesting and really engaging work. So we're also very, very keen to engage with the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Lived Experience Centre and other First Nations organisations to explore the most appropriate way to embed Aboriginal self-determination throughout the resources. The Victorian Suicide Prevention and Response Office have supported the beginning of this work through their Aboriginal social and emotional wellbeing team, which has been much appreciated. And similarly, we look forward to working with our LGBTIQA+ partners and friends, particularly in Switchboard, to ensure the resources further reflect issues of intersectionality of suicide with personal identity, life circumstance and multi-layered experiences. So I'm just about to hand over back to Jay Lee. So you all know the resources will be available on our website within 30 minutes of the conclusion of this webinar. And just finally, thank you all so much for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing to support you all to meaningfully integrate and partner with people with lived experience. So back to you, Jay Lee.
Thank you. I think you might just be getting a fire alarm going off in your building, Bron. Hopefully it's just a test. And thank you for just answering. I've noticed a number of comments, really positive comments in the chat coming through, and people were asking about where they can get them from. And I was pretty sure they're going to be on your website either already or very soon. And so thank you for clarifying that. So make sure everybody get your hands on them. They are freely available for you on the Roses in the Ocean website. And if you haven't been there before, it gives you a good opportunity to go and check it out and see what else that they've actually got on the Roses in the Ocean website. I also like the comments coming through on the chat about loving the LASEPI acronym. I actually made me feel a little bit hungry because I hadn't had lunch yet. It sounded like a really lovely Italian restaurant. I can kind of see the gingham tablecloths and others. So some acronyms work and some don't. So that's one that's, I think, is probably going to stick. And I'm looking forward to going and doing the organisational health check through your framework and tools as well. So thanks so much for kind of taking us through what is complex, important, but then translated to be simple and effective resources. Bron, really appreciated. Next in our proceedings, I'm going to hand over to someone that I've had the privilege of working very closely with in recent years. She's a fierce and compassionate leader in suicide prevention, and I'd actually say someone who was very forthright about wanting to hear from and learn from people with lived experience of suicide, particularly in preparing final advice to the Prime Minister on suicide prevention. So I will hand over now to Christine Morgan, who is the CEO of the National Mental Health Commission and the National Suicide Prevention Advisor.
Thanks, Jay Lee. I just had to remember to come off mute. I finally did it, thank God. And the privilege was all mine working with you, I've got to say. So look, thank you for being able to be here today, Bron. Wow, I'm blown away. But please let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands I'm joining you on from here in Sydney, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And as we always do, and we do without tokenism, we do with heartfelt sincerity, acknowledging all of those who have experienced, understand, or come to it within their remit, the reality of suicide across its full spectrum. It is a reality that touches all of us. And at that point, I see the absolute intersect of lived experience, because at the end of the day, lived experience from my perspective is very much there to explain to us and to others who need to understand it what the reality is across the full spectrum of suicide ideation, suicidal behaviour, suicidal crisis, suicidal bereavement, all of its aspects. It has a critical role to play, not just a useful role, but a critical one, because we cannot possibly meet this target of saving lives unless we truly understand what is happening for people at each of those touch points. So I acknowledge also every one of those people that have preceded the work that we are currently doing, along with Bronwyn and her fantastic team at Roses in the Ocean. Those people who have laid the path where it has been excruciatingly difficult to bring this topic up, to talk about it, and to start us on the pathway to understanding it. Thankfully, in 2022, we have general acceptance, including across government, as we've heard from Assistant Minister Coleman now, of that critical role of lived experience. We understand it is important. We understand that it is something that is not negotiable. And in fact, the mental health, and let me call it the suicide prevention reform agenda, which is currently now in play, has lived experience front and centre. So we know why we have to do it. We actually have government endorsement of it. And all of us across the board say, we're not letting go of that. And it is endorsement across all governments. So national, jurisdictional, and local governments. We've got all of those things there. Again, taking my hat off to those who have come before, as well as those who are working the journey. With these resources, I don't think it is possible to say anymore that we don't know how to do it. Because if you don't know how to do it, as we can say to anyone, go look at the resources. So cap off, Bron, to you, to the team, to everybody who's brought these together. Particular cap off, Sam, through you, to everybody with lived experience who's contributed to them. So now it's a question of actually doing it. And I'm with you, Jelly. I've seen all of the congratulatory comments and enthusiasm that's in the chat. It's up to us now. We actually have to put this into practice. We actually have to make organisations do it. We have to do it ourselves. Within the Commission, we have, as many people know, appointed the first Director of Lived Experience within the Commission. We are currently going out to market for a Director of Lived Experience in our National Suicide Prevention Office. We are putting it into play, the reality of what this is, to embed lived experience in decision-making, in informing, in conversation within organisations, within services, within policy. So we actually have to do it. We have to do it with a full diversity of representation. Yes, as Bron has said, it is not at the instance that everybody who has an exposure of risk to suicide has mental illness, but that is a group that is very strongly within there. We also know that there are priority populations that have particular vulnerabilities. I saw in one of the earlier chats today, somebody who is seeking to support a veteran who is having a pretty rocky time of it. So we know that there is incredible diversity amongst our lived experience. We know that the end goal is to use the lived experience to inform that which is not otherwise known. And Brian, you made the comment that we need to be able to actually take the collective of our stories and translate that into what is needed for particular initiatives, whether it's a policy initiative, whether it's a service initiative, whatever it may be. So there's a big journey ahead. We have the doors opened, we have walked through it. Let's own that space. We now have the particular challenge of ensuring that this is not only embedded, but goes to the true heart of how we do suicide prevention going forward, a real cultural change shift. So, Bron, thank you to you and the team for a fantastic suite of resources. Thank you, Sam, through you, for the leadership in ensuring that lived experience is right at the heart of those resources. Thank you to everyone who is continuing to work in this area. Let's go change it, because we now can. So let's go and do. So, Jaylee, thank you, and back to you.
Thank you much, Chris. Thanks so much, Christine. I'm sure Bronwyn and everyone on the webinar today really appreciates you taking the time to sit through the whole webinar and also to contribute some comments to the end of it. I think all of us are learning together, and it's important that we show up and show that we have got an interest and a desire to learn about how to do things better into the future. That's actually something that each and every one of us can do, regardless of where you're coming from in the suicide prevention sector. I'm just going to conclude out, I guess, the session today, and also say to people, if you've got any last questions or comments, just take the opportunity before we close out the webinar to put them in the Q&A or the chat, because the Rose in the Ocean team and their networks have committed to answering some of those questions, reaching out and providing people with the links or information that they might need. So I'll, as I'm kind of wrapping up, take that last couple of minutes to make sure that you write those into the chat. And I guess one of my final kind of reflections would be that we're never going to get the kind of whole of government, whole of community approach to suicide prevention that we desire unless we think about the whole of person, whole of journey, whole of experience at the same time. And as I said before, many of us have been working in suicide prevention perhaps a day or a week. Some of us have been working in suicide prevention for decades. But as we grow and we learn, we must also shift our practice. We must also shift the way in which we work. We must invite more in. We must give up power. We must sit together to design solutions going forward. And so I would also say really thank you to the team. I'm looking forward to digesting, also feeling a little uncomfortable as I work my way through the documents and perhaps find out where we are with our current practice and perhaps where we're not in places, and I invite everyone else to do the same. So thank you again to the Honourable David Coleman, to Christine Morgan, to Sam Phipps and to Bron Edwards for their participation in today's webinar. Thanks also to the Roses team for trusting me on steering you through the webinar from Newey. But also again to everybody who's contributed and everyone who's on the line who's making a difference to our suicide prevention work. Never forget that what we do together matters to people and to our communities. So thank you, everyone. Please access the resources so much that the Rose in the Ocean website crashes on us.
Thanks so much, Jaylee. Thanks everyone, Christine, Sam. Thanks for joining us.